Going to dive into this whole debate of whether Bond should return back to the past of the 1950s and 60s or stay in modern day. I'm going to give my thoughts on where I stand in the debate and looking at the pros and cons of each side of the argument. And that video is beginning right now. I'm sure all you Bond fans out there are hearing the rumours. They're literally all over Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Threads, you name it, about the possibility of Christopher Nolan directing multiple Bond pictures set in a period setting of the 1950s, the same time as the James Bond novels. Now, for me personally, when I stand on this, I am very, very excited about this. I want to be upfront right at the beginning here of this video. When it comes to this debate about should the Bond films potentially in a new reboot return back in time to like the 50s or 60s, I am very, very much in that base camp. If they were going to do something like this, now would be the time to do it. With the end of No Time to Die, it does set us up for a perfect hardcore reboot of the series. And if there was a chance to do a potential thing like this, this would definitely be the chance to do it. And Christopher Nolan has talked many times, he has had a specific idea of how he wants to do a James Bond film. He said many times he's very much influenced by On the Majesty's Secret Service and the old 60s Bond films. They're his favourite, and really would love to do potentially something within that. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I'm going to look at the pros and the cons of this potentially. What are the advantages, what are the disadvantages, and the end result is I hope you will comment in and tell me your thoughts and feelings about this. And can I just ask before we get into the whole debate, if you haven't already, do please consider giving us a like, comment and subscribe. We're trying to grow the channel this year. If you can help us, it would be really, really amazing. So sit back, relax, as we now go through, in my opinion, the advantages of taking Bond back in time. So the first thing that I want to bring up is how I think an advantage of Bond going back in time would be how it would make the Bond franchise a trendsetter again. Obviously, I wasn't around when Dr. No came out. I grew up in the 90s with Pierce Brosnan, my James Bond. But when Dr. No came out, it was a trendsetter. This was a different kind of hero. I keep going back to what Timothy Dalton said in that documentary Everything or Nothing. The meanest, dirtiest hero they'd ever seen. It was a whole new sort of cinematic hero that was James Bond's. The films were shot a bit differently. The style and the feel of the films was very much different to previous spy films and heroes that audiences expected in those times. Bond was a trendsetter. But over the years, eventually Bond became sort of following other trendsetters. Then it sort of solidified itself into its own thing. And then obviously with Brosnan and Craig, the whole massive mantra was almost to sort of modernise it. And then when reboots were becoming quite popular, Bond got right ahead of that and was a bit of a reboot trendsetter there. So one thing I really like about the possibility of Bond going back in time is this could be the start of a whole new trendsetter. Could we be seeing going forward future action series designed to take advantage of going back in time and doing films in a different time setting? I think that could be really amazing, and the James Bond series could be a leading light in that trend-setting style. The next thing on my list is very much clearly, it would be a very, very clear, fresh and new approach to the franchise. Something like going back in time now, going back to the 1950s, even before like Dr. No came out, which was set in the 60s, would be something completely new that I don't think we've seen any other franchise do. I really have been trying to think about franchises that set themselves in a certain time period and then decide to go back and do the same new story just in a different time setting, and I really can't think of anything off the top of my head. What I really get excited about with Bond going potentially back to the 50s or 60s is how it would really be something I feel audiences haven't truly seen before. Yes, I know we have seen Bonds in the 60s with Sean Connery. I know maybe some of you will be screaming at me, but hear me out here. Have we actually seen a franchise go back in time with modern day sentiments and modern day new styles and techniques and brought them back into a period piece? That I don't think has actually truly been done yet. I also think potentially this could be something audiences really truly lash onto with this approach. I think people will go, you know what, this is something different, this is something new, and if a director like Christopher Nolan does end up doing it, he is the sort of clout that audiences will go, okay, I trust in this could actually be something quite interesting here. And following on from that, you've also got to take into consideration, we know that it will look good because we've got the amazing Sean Connery and George Lazenby movies to look at as reference. I would struggle not to find a James Bond fan who doesn't love the aesthetic style and the look of Bond in the 60s in those films between Dr. No and On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Those films look absolutely incredible, and the 1960s is just bursting with such colour and vibrance and awesomeness in those films. I love how like Goldfinger going to those different locations in the 1960s. Let's face it, On Her Majesty's Secret Service is probably one of, if not the most beautiful James Bond film ever shot, with those sort of stars and those clothes and everything. We all know what a 60s James Bond film will look like, and wouldn't you not want to potentially see that again? For those of you who might be new to the channel, I grew up watching the James Bond films with my grandfather, and his James Bond, his era of James Bond really was the 60s Connery James Bonds. He absolutely adored them, and I think because of him I really grew a much bigger appreciation of that time period with James Bond. So for me, I think having a return to the 60s, we know what it will look like, we know what it could potentially feel like, and add a bit of a Christopher Nolan element to that. Just the word I come up with purely is chef's kiss. Now we're going on to, I think, the two biggest reasons why it could be really good that Bond could go back in time to the 50s and 60s is basically the different sort of stories you could tell. One of the things I really love about going back in time is I feel it opens up a whole new cascade of different stories and different approaches to stories that you could tell that necessarily you couldn't potentially do in a modern day setting. Let me give you an example. While Star Wars, in my opinion, is always far superior to Star Trek, what I loved about the Star Trek movies was how they always somehow did a sci-fi allegory to modern day things, such as The Undiscovered Country being about the end of the Cold War. Now, I think you could take certain modern day things such as, I don't know, global warming, or the issues, we have with Ukraine and Israel, with tech giants or whatever, and you could give it a sort of 1960s, 1950s overall, and have the Bond films be an allegory about stuff that is happening in modern day, but giving us the space to observe it from a different viewpoint, because in this version it's sort of set in the 1950s and 60s. I also think it opens up so many potential different characters, a bit more over the topness that you can have sort of acceptance with. You can have so much more fun with different locations and places you could go with it. There's so many, I think, different things you could do with a different time setting again with James Bond. And also, I think it's fair to say, with an added bonus, we obviously know history. And at the time they're making films, they didn't know what's going to happen next year or the year after that. And we could connect it with certain big events in history if we wanted to, and make Bond connected to them. And that, I think, could be really, really exciting and quite fascinating at the same time. The last thing I want to bring up when it comes to advantages of going back into the 1960s is I think it helps with some of the issues of modern day. I think it's fair to say, with the overuse of technology that we all have in our lives, with GPS, when it comes to Bond not just being allowed to be an agent out in the field relying on his wits. There's so much now in the modern day that sort of hinders what I think to a lot of us Bond fans Bond was back in the day. Now, they have taken use of and advantage of technology in great ways, whether it being for the villain's purposes or ways that has helped Bond, and it's great, don't get me wrong. But I think if you can go back to a time where there isn't so many modern hindrances and have the character really go back to its roots and tell stories that existed within the original novels, times and feels, that to me is just really potentially exciting. You could remove some of the obstacles we have with the overuse of technology or other things going on currently in the world that does affect things, and really sort of go back to telling a great old school spy espionage thriller. I think that to me is one of the, if not the best reason for Bond to go back into the 1960s. But as I say, that is just the pros of potentially going back in time to the 1950s and 60s. Let's be fair, and let's now really look into maybe, I think these reasons are actually quite valid, some of the issues that could happen if Bond did return back to being a period piece. One of the things Michael Wilson has said repeatedly whenever there's a new Bond film comes out, it's always a challenge to keep the films up to date and relevant. He's often said that, you know, just doing the same old resting on your laurels and just doing the same thing, it ain't broke, don't fix it, is a problem. You should always try and be different and new. It's a form of complacency. And to be fair, I think he's actually right there. However, this is where the issue comes in. If you set the films back in time, it does lose that up-to-dateness. It does lose potentially that, you know, that complacency. We know what Bond is like in the 60s. We know it works. So we're just basically relying on that. One of the great things about setting in the modern day is you've got the new challenges and the new things come up, and you can connect Bond to that. That allows it to be a bit different and new every time a new film comes out. One other thing I think we also must consider here, and I think this is a very, very valid and important thing, is, well, maybe not all of us Bond fans want it, we would potentially accept it, but would the mass audiences accept a period piece James Bond? I know for a fact that a lot of, like, you know, casual viewers who will just go watch the Bond film when it comes out just because it's in the cinemas, if I told them they were going to go back in time, they would be a bit, would we, should we, I don't know, I like it how they're just, you know, like in the modern day you just watch them and stuff like that. So there is an issue I think here that if you were to go back in time, would just like the traditional normal audiences actually be slightly turned off by that? You know, that could be a potential possibility. Most of the audiences just want to go and watch a film and enjoy themselves. They don't want to know, oh yes, now we're going to go back in time, or well, you know, I can just sense a lot of potential where that could be an issue going forward with just the general audiences when it comes to James Bond. The next thing I really want to bring up here, why it could be a potentially bad idea, is that it could lose its relevancy. One of the great things about James Bond, and it has been since the Brosnan era in my opinion, is the films really have tried to reflect being up to date with the time period that they were made in and connected to things going on, which made them feel so much more real and important. If you, again, take the films back in time, and again, even though I said they could be great allegory stories, you could lose that relevancy, which a lot of audiences and just general everyone who watches James Bond talks about it, they do latch onto, and that is just stripped away. So you need to give them something else instead that could basically fill that gap. But could you? Could you really? The last thing I want to bring up in reasons why it might be a bad idea is the loss of product placements. Now, ever since Casino Royale, we really have this overabundance of product placement. And it does generate a lot of revenue, it does help pay for the budgets of these films, and product placement is important. I don't deny that, and I accept that. Now, if you were to go back in time, that's basically a lot of your product placement just poof, out the window. Bond films rely on product placement just to get their budgets done, it's fair. However, I don't think this could be an issue going forward anymore, and there's another issue I have here when it comes to product placement. Now the fact that Amazon own MGM, they don't need to worry about money anymore. Amazon have just got billions of dollars going spare. So I don't think you need to worry that much now with the Bond series when it comes to product placement. And a bit of a rant I will admit here, but it's something against all films in general in the industry nowadays. Films are costing far too much. I mean, the recent Fast and Furious movie costing over $300 million? That is a Bond villain sort of scheme or something. It has to be. Budgets in general are just going too high, too big. It's just terrible in my opinion. And Bond, no matter what, I think needs to be scaled back. One of the best films of recent years, it's not even probably that recent anymore, was actually, in my opinion, Skyfall. One of the cheapest Bond budgets of recent years with only just 150 million, and I think, hands down, the best in the Craig era, in my opinion. So everyone, that is my thoughts and feelings when it comes to should Bond be set in the past or stay in the future. And again, I've made it very clear at the beginning of this video, I am firmly on the camp of Bond should go back in time and be a period piece. I think it would be a really, really good idea. But I also understand and accept there are those issues when it comes to if it's not set in the modern day. But I want to know, what are your thoughts and opinions about this? I really want to hear what you're all thinking about this. What are your opinions on it? And what would you like to see? Everyone, thank you so much for watching as always. Take care. Goodbye.